Hi everyone. This recording goes with chapter 7 in Ward and Mama, and this is all about communication. The metaphor in social work that we usually use for communicating is sort of building bridges and building not building walls. Hence the title. You can think of a bridge as sort of a connection that exists between two people, maybe the client and the social worker, the social worker and supervisor, or something like that. But in many ways, communication is sort of at the heart of what we do, because communication helps to bring people together and create a plan for moving forward. And in order to do that, one has to be able to sort of communicate kind of effectively. Now, most of us can, communicate without any problems, but this idea of communicating effectively means that the point that we're trying to make is easily understood or easily accessible by the person who's listening to us, and it isn't muddied or cloudy or unclear in some way. Communication obviously involves our sort of our voice, but also our kind of our nonverbal communication as well. And so there's a lot of dimensions to sort of think about verbal and nonverbal communication. Obviously, there's our tone, there's the speed at which we talk, there's the choice of vocabulary. And so if you see what I did there, I replaced the word words with something that might be a little bit more elevated. Was, is this appropriate in a class lecture? Probably. Is this appropriate if I were meeting with a client whose education I'm unsure of, or who's maybe not completed high school or something like that? Well, then I might not pick a word like vocabulary. I might pick a different word. And then, of course, a significant part of our communication is nonverbal communication. Our gesture, our posture, our facial expressions, our body movements, eye contact, so on and so forth. A lot of the communicating that we do has to do with pulling information out of clients, or providing a space, maybe not pulling information out of clients, but providing a space where they're free to sort of put some information out there. So sometimes what we do is we reflect feelings, or we paraphrase, we ask open-ended questions, we think about eye contact, or we say things that further the response. So when you reflect feeling, you say something like, you sound angry when you say that, or you sound frustrated when you say that. Or I'm detecting a little bit of exasperation in your tone. Is that what you're feeling? Paraphrasing is summarizing. So I heard you. So I heard you say something. I heard you talk about how frustrated you are with your partner. Why don't you tell me more about that? Right? Open-ended questions have open-ended responses to them. Eye contact, and then furthering the response. Eye contact hopefully is self-evident. Furthering the response is saying things like, say more, or tell me more about that. And a lot of these things can be done sort of verbally, but a lot can be done non-verbally as well. One of the things, interestingly, that Ward and Mama kind of left out of this was use of silence. When a person is a new social worker, oftentimes silence is very uncomfortable. Silence feels overwhelming. It's sort of deafening in a sense. I can say with absolute certainty that when you as a new social worker feel tempted to say something to fill the silence, the client does not experience it that way. They're thinking, they're reflecting, they're trying to choose words, they're processing, right? Their sort of gears are turning in their head. So their experience of silence is very different than our experience of silence. And I actually think that silence is a pretty powerful sort of communication tool that we have in our toolbox of things. This chapter also covers sort of communicating with colleagues, um, um, which is also a sort of a big part of the communication that we do, especially when you're trying to marshal resources, in service of a particular client or something like that. Um, and so, this is really about making sure our communication with clients is ethical and professional and responsible. That if we're communicating with clients, it's information um, that we're able to share, according to agency policy and stakeholder policy, that kind of thing. Culturally, let me put myself down here. Culturally competent uh, sort of components of communicating include thinking about things like eye contact and whether someone should be called Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. or Miss, or what their gender pronouns are, um, who to address initially, whether you're addressing one partner in a dyad, or a parent or a child, and then sort of making eye contact. These are tough things, and these are things that these are tough things to negotiate, particularly when you're communicating across cultures. And the way that I think is best to navigate this is to talk about what the client expects with them, or talk about what makes them most comfortable. The other thing to do is, of course, talk with a supervisor about how to plan for a cross-cultural contact with a cross-cultural client. This sort of macro communication, right? So we did sort of a micro, meso, macro kind of thing. When we communicate with communities, typically, we're doing that through, radio or TV or email, social media, that kind of thing. But we should be sort of planning our communication so that it's accessible. It communicates our message. It does so clearly, language that's accessible to everyone. Effective communication with the community can be really tough, and one of the best ways to do that is to think about sort of a multi-pronged approach. So, advertisements on TV or radio and social media posts, or mailing letters, mailing leaflets or something like that, and billboards, sort of this multi-pronged way. And of course, the difficulty in that is making sure that the message is unified across all of those different forms of communication. And of course, the other thing to think about is who's doing that communicating. It ideally should be a trusted member of the community, not some outsider. Trusted member could be a clergy person, an elected official, someone who's well known, a celebrity, a sports star, that kind of thing. Social workers use what's called person-first language, and you may have heard this, but maybe not have heard the name for it. But person-first language is basically changing it from a disabled person to a person with a disability, or an autistic person to a person with autism, an alcoholic versus a person with alcohol use disorder. So it's putting the person ahead of what the disease or diagnosis or problem is. What that does is it sort of assigns value, or it prioritizes, at least in the listener's mind, that the person is a person first and not a diagnosis first. So this all came about as that that sort of shift away from sort of identifying people by their diagnosis, and really making sure we're identifying them as people. Nonverbal communication is sort of a important thing to reflect on. I don't know where they got this, that 93% of communication is nonverbal. I don't know I don't know how you would evaluate. I don't know how anyone would evaluate that, but um, we do communicate an awful lot, right? If someone, if you ask someone how they're doing and their response is fine, right? I mean, obviously they're not doing fine. Um, their 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 nonverbal communication suggests something much different. As the person on the professional side of the relationship, your job is to really understand how your nonverbal communication um, complements or works with your verbal communication to enhance what it is you're trying to do with a client. So that's the best way to do that is to sort of reflect on sort of what your strengths in nonverbal communication are, and um, what your uh, what some of the things you could work on are. I have a lot of psychomotor activity, right? Psychomotor activity is hand gestures, and things like that. And since we've moved to Zoom here, and since the pandemic started, I've had to do a lot less communicating with my hands because you can't see them if they're outside of the range of the camera. Um, Back when we could meet face to face, a lot of times my nonverbal communication would take up a lot of room, right? It take up a lot of space between sort of the client and I. So one of the things I learned very quickly was that if I'm going to do this, I have to, if I'm going to have, psychomotor activity, I'm going to have to sort of pull it in a little bit and keep it a little bit closer to my, my sort of center of mass. Um, so there are a number of different kinds of nonverbal communication, and I realize you probably can't see that up top there, but that says proxemics, how physically close we get to people. Um, Kinesics are how we appear, our posture, how you carry yourself. Our the sort of orientation of our body. Haptics and olfactics are sort of touch and um, smell. Um, there are actually, the place I work at now has actually a no scent policy, um, and there's reasons for that, but basically they felt that smell could get in the way of certain things, and so um, cologne, perfume, strongly scented lotions, things like that. They're all sort of banned, just because people felt like it got in the way of the work of that particular agency. Paralanguage is the tone, the pitch, the speed, the volume, kind of all these things that we've been talking about before. And this is a word I always have trouble pronouncing, but oculesics is sort of eye contact, right? So there's obviously appropriate levels of eye contact and inappropriate, and that might vary between clients. It might even vary in the same session with the client. Sometimes it's important to sort of look away and not make eye contact while a client is processing or thinking or sort of reflecting on something. That sort of gives them a little bit of space to go through the cognitive exercises that they're going through in their mind. And then, of course, our environment communicates an awful lot too. You can see what's behind me, right? I have some books, and that obviously communicates something about who I am and what it is I do. But in sort of an office setting, you might have a degree, a diploma, pictures. So all of these things sort of communicate things, and the point is to do so sort of purposefully, so that your work is your goal, what you're doing with the client, is sort of prioritized. Lastly, we're talking about the written word, and I realize you can't see that word up there, but or that phrase up there. It says choice of words. Obviously, we've talked about notes and things like that, but in our notes, we need to be writing logically and clearly, just as we need to be, speaking logically and clearly. And we need to be making sure our our intent and our meaning is clear. The big sort of takeaway from communication is that this is part of reflective social work. Communication is part of reflective social work. You're reflecting on how your presence makes other people feel, right? So does your use of self kind of all form a cohesive whole so that you are an effective social worker? And that is really developed through good supervision and good, sort of honest reflecting with yourself and the kind of work you're doing. So thanks for watching. As always, I hope this was helpful. And of course, feel free to be in touch with questions.